Hey everybody, this is a chapter from Marx in Russia, The Fate of a Doctrine by James D. White. This chapter is called Towards the, quote, Short Course, end quote. First section is titled Bukharin. The Bolshevik Revolution was a turning point in the history of Marxism, not only in Russia but also throughout the world. From then on, Russia was regarded as the country in which Marxism had triumphed. Marxists everywhere looked on the Russian Communist Party as the organization which knew how to make a socialist revolution and saw the Russian Communist Party as the organization to emulate. This attitude was encouraged by the Bolsheviks and was a central theme of the Communist International, which was founded in 1919. A consequence of the Bolsheviks coming to power was that in the Soviet period, Marxist theory took on an apologetic role, that of defending and justifying Soviet practice. Lenin's The State and Revolution was the first work to fulfill this function. When The State and Revolution was published in 1918, the State and Revolution's significance was no longer that of directing the revolution, how the revolution was to be carried out, but of providing the rationale for the dictatorship of the proletariat and the Bolsheviks' refusal to institute a representative democracy. The first substantive theoretical work published in the Soviet era was The ABC of Communism by Bukharin and E. A. Preobrazhensky. According to Wikipedia, The ABC of Communism is a book written by Nikolai Bukharin and Evgeny Preobrazhensky in 1919 during the Russian Civil War. Originally written to convince the proletariat of Russia to support the Bolsheviks, The ABC of Communism became, quote, an elementary textbook of communist knowledge, end quote. The ABC of Communism became the best known and most widely circulated of all pre-Stalinist expositions of Bolshevism and the most widely read political work in Soviet Russia. It was originally published in 1920. That's what Wikipedia has to say. Back to the text. The idea that mastery of the banks will provide control of the economic system no longer appears, and the description of how a socialist system will function draws upon Bogdanov's ideas. The portrayal of the distribution system of communist society is reminiscent of Bogdanov's in Red Star. Wikipedia says Red Star is a science fiction novel by the Russian writer Alexander Bogdanov, published in 1908, about a communist society on Mars. While in many ways praiseworthy, the society depicted is far from perfect, especially that Bogdanov's Martians seriously consider the option of conquering and colonizing Earth and perpetrating a wholesale genocide of humanity. The first edition was published in St. Petersburg in 1908 before eventually being republished in Moscow and Petrograd in 1918, and then again in Moscow in 1922. Set in early Russia during the Revolution of 1905, and additionally on a fictional socialist society on Mars, the novel tells the story of Lenin, a Russian scientist revolutionary who travels to Mars to learn and experience their socialist system and to teach them of his own world. In the process, he becomes enamored of the people and technological efficiency that he encounters in this new world. An English translation by Charles Ruggell was published in 1984. Back to the text. The portrayal of the distribution system of communist society is reminiscent of Bogdanov's in Red Star. Quote, products are ... neither bought nor sold. They are simply stored in communal warehouses and are subsequently delivered to those who need them. In such conditions, money will no longer be required ... The main direction will be entrusted to various kinds of bookkeeping offices or statistical bureau. There, from day to day, account will be kept of production and all of production's needs. There also it will be decided whither workers must be sent, and hence workers must be taken, and how much work there is to be done, end quote. Preobrazhensky and Bukharin, ABC of Communism. The similarity between Red Star and the ABC of Communism is not fortuitous, since Bukharin was an admirer of Bogdanov's book. It is remarkable, however, to reflect that the best vision of a socialist economy that was available to the Bolsheviks in the revolutionary era was one that was taken from Bogdanov's novel. After 1917, Bukharin emerged as the principal Marxist theoretician of the Soviet regime. His Economics of the Transition Period One second. According to Routledge, it says, it was published with Routledge in 1979. And the description says, for many years, a neglected figure, Nikolai Bukharin, has recently been the subject of renewed interest in the West. Now regarded as a leading Marxist theorist, Bukharin's work has wide appeal to those interested in Soviet history and Marxist economics, as well as to those concerned with theories of development in socialist economies. The sections of the politics and economics of the transition period include Part 1, the theory of the dictatorship, a general theory of the state, the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the collapse of democracy and the dictatorship of the proletariat, Soviet power as a form of proletarian dictatorship. Part 2, the economics of the transition period, the structure of world capitalism, economic state power and war, the collapse of the capitalist system, the general preconditions for the building of communism, town and country in the process of social transformation, the productive forces, the costs of the revolution and the technical revolution, the general organizational forms of the transition period, the systems of production control under the dictatorship of the proletariat, the economic categories of capitalism in the transition period, quote, non-economic, end quote, coercion in the transition period, the world revolutionary process and the world system of communism. Part 3, diagrammatic tables related to the economics of the transition period. Back to the text. Bukharin's Economics of the Transition Period was published in 1920 as the Civil War drew to a close. This book reassessed Marxist thinking about socialism in the light of the experience of the young Soviet regime. Its main emphasis was that the transition to socialism could not be smooth and involved a great deal of hardship and privation. The idea that capitalism had created the institutions that could be taken over as they stood by a socialist government would have to be abandoned. Socialist revolution involved the disruption of the existing economic system, and with it a severe loss of production in all sectors. One example of an idea that had to be abandoned was Hilferding's contention that the seizure of possession of 6 large Berlin banks by the proletariat would give the proletariat control of the whole of industry. Bukharin pointed out that it had been empirically proved that nothing of the kind took place. In reality, the seizure of the banks merely undermined the commanding power of capital. In explaining why this was the case, Bukharin reproduced Bogdanov's argument that the control of the banks over industry was much looser and more indirect than Hilferding had imagined. The banks could not control industry. Quote, for the reason that the banks, quote, rule industry on the basis of specific relations of money-credit. The mode of connection is here the mode of credit connection, and is just this which collapses when the proletariat seizes possession of the banks, end quote. Bukharin. In other words, the rationale that Lenin had given for a smooth takeover of the institutions of capitalism had been mistaken. How did Bukharin explain the revolution in Russia? He did this with the help of techtology and Bogdanov's concept of the, quote, law of the least, end quote. Wikipedia says, techtology, sometimes transliterated as techtology, same pronunciation, different spelling, is a term used by Alexander Bogdanov to describe a new universal science that consisted of unifying all social, biological, and physical sciences by considering them as systems of relationships and by seeking the organizational principles that underline all systems. Techtology is now regarded as a precursor of systems theory and related aspects of synergetics. The word, quote, techtology, end quote, was introduced by Ernst Haeckel, but Bogdanov used it for a different purpose. Back to the text. How did Bukharin explain the revolution in Russia? Bukharin did this with the help of techtology and Bogdanov's concept of the, quote, the law of the least, end quote. According to Bukharin, the individual capitalist states were linked together in a chain-like connection as component elements of an integrated world system. A crisis causing disturbance of equilibrium in one part of the system would inevitably spread to the others. The World War created just such a crisis, so that the system of world economy began to disintegrate. Quote, with which links of the chain, end quote, Bukharin asked, quote, was the collapse bound to begin, end quote. Bukharin's answer was that, quote, it stands to reason that it was bound to begin with those links that were the weakest in terms of capitalist organization, end quote. Bukharin. When Lenin read the passage in Bukharin's book, he commented in a marginal note, quote, untrue, with the moderately weak link, without a certain level of capitalism, nothing would have happened here in Russia, end quote. Given Lenin's hostility to Bogdanov, which is well reflected in other marginal notes, it is not surprising that Lenin was not impressed by Bukharin's applications of Bogdanov's, quote, law of the least, end quote. Lenin was emphatically not an adherent of the, quote, weakest link, end quote, theory. That's an interesting statement, so I'll reread it. Lenin was emphatically not an adherent of the, quote, weakest link, end quote, theory. Sorry, I was looking to see if there's anything I can find that would help me get the context for what I'm reading. But what Lenin did admire in Bukharin's book was the chapter on, quote, extra economic compulsion in the transition period, end quote, which justified the use of force not only against landowners and capitalists, but the enemies of the proletariat. Not only against landowners and capitalists, the enemies of the proletariat, but against the proletariat itself. Bukharin agreed that under communism there would be absolute freedom, and that there would be no kind of external regulation of relationships between people. In the transition period, however, compulsion was necessary, because the proletariat was not a homogeneous group. While some parts of the proletariat, the vanguard, were advanced, relatively broad circles bore the stamp of the capitalist commodity world. To make the majority of workers conform to the standard of the vanguard, compulsory discipline was needed. Because this discipline was imposed by the working class on the working class for the working class's own interests, this discipline differed fundamentally from the discipline and compulsion formerly imposed upon the working class externally by the bourgeoisie. For Bukharin, the use of force against the peasantry was absolutely necessary because the peasantry resisted the system of compulsory labor and the attempt to restrain the free market in grain. There was, moreover, no alternative to compulsion, since the exhausted cities could offer no equivalent for the grain that the cities requisitioned. In the long run, Bukharin argued, proletarian compulsion in all its forms, quote, from shootings to labor service, end quote, would serve the purpose of creating a classless society. Following the period of intense class struggle when society had fragmented, a new equilibrium would be established in which class divisions became blurred and finally disappeared altogether. When this came about, compulsion in every form would disappear once and for all. A question that Bukharin raised in Economics of the Transition Period was, were those methods and categories of thinking that Marx applied to capitalist society valid for the time in which capitalism had broken down and the foundations were being laid for a socialist society? The answer to this question had already been prefigured in the opening sentence of his book. This was that theoretical political economy was the science of a social economy that was based on commodity production. That is the science of an unorganized social economy. In other words, Marx's analysis of capitalism was not applicable to the planned economy that Russia was in the process of creating. With reference to the economic phenomena of the time, Bukharin argued that there were no commodities, no value, no wages, no profit or surplus value, and no commodity fetishism. A question that Bukharin did not ask himself was, to what extent had these categories of a capitalist economy been developed in Russia prior to the 1917 revolution? That's a very important question. I want to repeat it. A question that Bukharin did not ask himself was, to what extent had these categories of a capitalist economy been developed in Russia prior to the 1917 revolution? It could just as well have been argued that the Russian economy had not sufficiently advanced to be characterized by these categories than to argue that it had somehow surpassed these categories. Oppositions. The Red victory in the Civil War had been an enormous cost in human life. Economically, the country was devastated, both the country's agriculture and the country's industry in ruins. In 1920, the system of compulsory grain requisitions was still in force, causing deprivation to the peasantry without being able to feed adequately the diminishing urban population. The militarization of the Soviet state had encouraged centralization of power and the suppression of popular initiative. The restrictions on press freedom and other civil rights that had been introduced by the Bolsheviks on their accession to power as temporary measures had become permanent. Sympathetic socialist visitors to Soviet Russia in 1920, such as Alexander Berkman, Emma Goldman, and Bertrand Russell, who had expected to find there the making of a socialist society, were quickly disillusioned by the reality that confronted them and which they documented in contemporary accounts. While the Red Army was still quelling peasant revolts up and down this country, a number of opposition movements emerged during the course of 1920. One of these was the workers' opposition, which called for the greater rights of the trade unions in the running of the economy. I have the theses, I think it's called the theses, of the workers' opposition by Alexander Shlepnikov on this channel. I also have a piece by Barbara C. Allen, who's I think she wrote a big biography on Alexander Shlepnikov. I don't have anything from Alexander Kollontai. I guess that's because I'm a huge sexist, but I just haven't done that yet, and I should. One of these was the workers' opposition, which called for greater rights for the trade unions in the running of the economy. The theoretical case of the workers' opposition was made by Alexander Kollontai, who called for a return to the elective principle, freedom of expression, and the elimination of bureaucracy by making all officials answerable to the public at large. Kollontai pointed out that the aspirations of the workers' opposition were in keeping with the dictum of Marx and Engels that the creation of socialism must be the affair of the workers themselves. In the context of 1920 to 21, this dictum had become subversive and associated with opposition movements. The claims that were made in the slur or the epithet frequently hurled at the workers' opposition was anarcho-syndicalist deviationists by Lenin. In 1921, they outlawed the forming of factions within the Bolshevik Party, which basically used to silence the workers' opposition, which was concurrent with the events happening in Kronstadt. For me, that's a very important period, early 1921, the suppression of Kronstadt and the banning of factions within the Bolshevik Party at the 10th Party Congress. But that's just me talking. Another opposition current, the Democratic Centralists, argued that since coming to power, the Bolshevik Party had betrayed its own ideals. They opposed the bureaucratic centralism of Lenin's Central Committee and insisted that every important question should be discussed by the party rank and file before decisions were taken. The most serious opposition movement, however, was that by the sailors of the Kronstadt naval base on the Gulf of Finland at the beginning of 1921. It was a dangerous rebellion since the sailors were an armed force and located near Petrograd, where they were likely to attract wide support among the workers. The demands of the sailors included ones that could be classed as basic human rights. Democratic elected Soviets, freedom of speech and the press for workers, peasants, and left socialist parties, the release of political prisoners from socialist parties. The response of the Soviet government was to storm the Kronstadt fortress, imprison the sailors on the mainland, and shoot them in batches over the next few months. See Victor Serge, 1963. The feature that the opposition movements had in common was the demands that they put forward were the democratic forms that the Bolshevik Party itself professed to subscribe to. But in the situation following the Civil War, the call for democracy was a threat to the very existence of the Bolshevik regime. At the 10th Party Congress in March 1921, Bukharin justified the rejection of the demands of the workers' opposition and the democratic centralists in the same terms Lenin had justified the use of force in the Bukharin, At the 10th Party Congress in March 1921, Bukharin justified the rejection of the demands of the workers' opposition and the democratic centralists in the same terms that he had justified the use of force in the economics of the transition period. Bukharin's argument was that it was impossible to have formal democracy because in that case the working class would be swallowed up in the petty bourgeois peasant masses. Even working class democracy would be extremely dangerous because the advanced group of workers was a small minority among the vast majority who were subject to petty bourgeois influences through its ties with the villages. Bogdanov himself took no part in any opposition movement, but the anti-authoritarian spirit which suffused Bogdanov's writings, which were still being published, was a standing reproach to Lenin's government. There was an echo of this in Kollontaj's pamphlet, The Workers' Opposition. Which is available in libcom. I just looked up. There was an echo of this in Kollontaj's pamphlet, The Workers' Opposition, and the very concept of, quote, democratic centralism, end quote, owed its existence to Bogdanov. Also important politically was what Bogdanov's writings did not say. Nowhere did Bogdanov endorse Lenin's use of the term, quote, the dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, the formula by which the Bolsheviks justified their resort to force against the people. The dictatorship of the proletariat's absence in Bogdanov's writings implied Bogdanov's refusal to accept the Bolshevik regime's legitimacy. In the circumstances, it is understandable that Bogdanov's ideas would have the potential to inspire democratic opposition to the Soviet regime. In September 1920, Lenin had launched his campaign against Bogdanov with the publication of a new edition of Materialism and Imperial Criticism. For this, Lenin commissioned V.I. Nevsky to write a foreword, whose basic message was that Lenin's work was still valid because, despite its appearance of novelty, techtology embodied the same idealist principles as Imperial Monism and other of Bogdanov's writings that Lenin had criticized in the first edition of the book. Sorry, I'm not really seeing anything for Imperial Monism. What the hell was I going to look up? V.I. Nevsky. Vladimir Nevsky. That looks promising. Vladimir Ivanovich Nevsky, born 1876 and died 1937, was a Russian revolutionary, Bolshevik functionary, Soviet statesman, professor, and historian. So yeah, back to the thing I was just reading. Back to the text. From this, Lenin commissioned V.I. Nevsky to write a foreword whose basic message was that Lenin's work was still valid because, despite its appearance of novelty, techtology embodied the same idealist principles as Imperiomonism and other of Bogdanov's writings that Lenin had criticized in the first edition of his book. The reissue of Lenin's Materialism and Imperiocriticism with Nevsky's foreword had the effect of encouraging a vigorous anti-Bogdanov campaign in the press. Sorry. I wanted to look up. Yeah, I thought so. I don't know why it's not the first thing to pop up. Alexander Bogdanov's Imperiomonism Essays in Philosophy, books 1 to 3, was released with the Historical Materialism book series by Brill, and then published in a cheaper form with the Historical Materialism book series. And the description of that book says Imperiomonism is Alexander Bogdanov's scientific philosophical substantiation of Marxism. In books 1 and 2, Bogdanov combines Ernst Mach's and Richard Avenarius's neutral monist philosophy with the theory of psychophysical parallelism and systematically demonstrates that human psyches are thoroughly natural and are subject to nature's laws. In Book 3, Bogdanov argues that Imperiomonism is superior to G.V. Plekhanov's outdated materialism and shows how the principles of Imperiomonism solve the basic problem of historical materialism, how society's material base causally determines its way of thinking. Bogdanov concludes that Imperiomonism is of the same order as materialist systems, and, since it is the ideology of the productive forces of society, it is a Marxist philosophy. Back to the text. The reissue of Lenin's Materialism and Imperiocriticism with Nevsky's foreword had the effect of encouraging a vigorous anti-Bogdanov campaign in the press. The adoption of Plekhanov as the approved interpreter of Marxist theory was encouraged by Lenin as a means of countering Bogdanov's influence. During the debate on the trade unions in January 1921, Lenin had remarked, quote, "Let me add in parenthesis, for the benefit of young party members, that it is impossible to become a conscious, genuine communist without studying, and I mean studying." Everything that Plekhanov has written on philosophy because nothing better exists in the international literature on Marxism, end quote, Lenin. He urged that the Soviet state should demand that professors of philosophy should have a knowledge of Plekhanov's exposition of Marxist philosophy and the ability to impart it to their students. Apparently such professors were not in abundance in 1921, so the followers of Plekhanov, A. Deborin and L. Orthodox, were invited to lecture at this Sverdlov University, despite the fact that both of them had been Mensheviks. One second. Abram Moiseyevich Deborin, who lived from 1881 to 1963, was a Soviet Marxist philosopher and academician of the Academy of Sciences of the Soviet Union, 1929. Deborin oscillated between the Bolshevik and Menshevik factions of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party before settling with the Bolsheviks and enjoying a long career as a philosopher in the Soviet Union. Abram Moiseyevich Deborin Although this career suffered under Stalin, Abram Moiseyevich Deborin lived to see his works republished when the Soviet Union was led by Nikita Khrushchev. Okay, so that's Deborin and L. Orthodox. So I can't find anything on Orthodox. Apparently such professors, back to the text, apparently such professors were not in abundance in 1921. So the followers of Plekhanov, A. Deborin, and L. Orthodox were invited to lecture at the Sverdlov University, despite the fact that both of them had been Mensheviks. The official endorsement of Plekhanov as the approved interpreter of Marxism lasted until Lenin's death in 1924, from which time Leninism became the official Soviet doctrine. From 1920, Bogdanov's name disappeared from the historical record. Bogdanov was not mentioned in histories of the Bolshevik Party, and Bogdanov's works were not referred to. This situation persisted right up to the fall of the Soviet Union. Had it not been for his negative mention in Lenin's materialism and imperial criticism, a major figure in Russian intellectual history would have passed completely into oblivion. New section. Stalin's Fundamentals of Leninism. A Stalinist at my college tried to gave me, he didn't try, it did give me this book after I gave him a book titled, that was the illustrated, Marxist Capital Illustrated. He gave me this book. But Wikipedia says, Foundations of Leninism was a 1924 collection made by Joseph Stalin that consisted of 9 lectures Stalin delivered at Sverdlov University that year. It was published by the Soviet newspaper Pravda. I'm going to look up Sverdlov University, too. I'm going to read the synopsis, according to Wikipedia, of Foundations of Leninism. Stalin's 9 lectures covered the historical roots of Leninism, methods, theory, the dictatorship of the proletariat, the peasant question, the national question, strategy and tactics, 2 lectures, and style of work. Stalin focused his first lecture on the issue of the historical roots of Leninism as a form of Marxism. According to Stalin, Leninism is a product of imperialism and a guiding ideology of the Bolsheviks. Stalin lists 3 contradictions which imperialism brings to capitalism. The contradiction between labor and capital, the contradiction between financial groups and imperialist nations, the contradiction between ruling nations and colonial dependent nations and peoples. These factors associated with imperialism increase the contradictions already present in capitalist countries. The lecture builds on Lenin's writings about the nature of imperialism, particularly 1917's imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Stalin opens his second lecture on methods with a reference to the period of the Second International in which Karl Kautsky and other orthodox Marxists adopted, quote, opportunistic and, quote, revisionist principles to preserve unity in the social democratic parties. It was due to this opportunism that Kautsky and the parties did not endorse revolutionary socialist tactics and programs, instead favoring Edward Bernstein's reformism. According to Stalin, the Second International became, quote, antiquated, quote, chauvinistic, and, quote, narrow-minded at the onset of World War I by supporting the war and opposing violent proletarian revolution. Leninism, with Leninism's success in the October Revolution and the Russian Civil War, became Marxism's main legitimate tendency. Stalin defines the methods of Leninism as testing the theoretical dogmas of the Second International and the restoration of theory and practice, testing the policy of the parties of the Second International, reorganization of all party work along new revolutionary lines, preparing the masses for revolutionary struggle, self-criticism, with the party as a means of regulating opinion and asserting strategy. The concept of self-criticism was developed and expanded as an essential component of party politics, with Stalin justifying the doctrine by citing Lenin's left-wing communism and infantile disorder. Self-criticism, according to Stalin, should be considered an essential component of Leninist, Marxist-Leninist political ideology. Okay, so to the text now. Stalin's Fundamentals of Leninism. Following Lenin's death, Stalin delivered a series of lectures entitled On the Foundations of Leninism, which were published in Pravda in April and May 1924. The lectures are most renowned for being the occasion on which Stalin announced his theory of, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, a theory which Stalin attributed to Lenin. I meant to say I looked up Sverdlov Communist University as well. Sverdlov Communist University was a school for Soviet activists in Moscow, founded in 1918 as the Central School for Soviet and Party Work. After the death of the Bolshevik leader Yakov Sverdlov, the institution was named after him. Its founding rector was Vladimir Nevsky, who wrote the foreword to the later published in the Soviet period edition of Lenin's what's it called? I can't even think of the name of the book right now. It's eluding me. Anyway, you know the book, Materialism and Imperial Criticism, or whatever. Anyway, back to the text. The other thing that Stalin attributed to Lenin in the lectures was the revolutionary theory that, quote, the front of capital will be pierced where the chain of imperialism is weakest, for the proletarian revolution is the result of the breaking of the chain of the world imperialist front and its weakest link, end quote. In 1917, the chain of the imperialist world front proved to be weaker in Russia than in the other countries. It was there that the chain broke and provided an outlet for the proletarian revolution. This was a remarkable assertion because, as we know, Lenin did not subscribe to the theory of the, quote, chain of imperialism broke at its weakest link, end quote. In fact, Lenin would have nothing to do with a theory that was couched in terms of chains and links because it quite obviously had its source in Bogdanov's technology. Then one can understand why Stalin made the attribution. If, as Lenin maintained, the revolution in Russia was a socialist revolution, it was incumbent upon him to explain how it was that in an economically backward country like Russia, where the proletariat was in a minority, a socialist revolution was possible. The historically accurate answer to this question was that in 1917, Lenin had believed, following Hilferding, that the creation of trusts and syndicates by finance capital had prepared the grounds for a socialist society, and that by gaining control of the banks, one could establish a centrally controlled economic system. Unfortunately, this idea had turned out to be illusory, and one simply took a pragmatic approach to problems as they rose. Historical accuracy, however, was not among Stalin's priorities, and most probably at Bukharin's suggestion, Stalin attributed Bogdanov's idea to Lenin, who of course was unable to protest. The ruse was successful because not only was the false attribution not noted and exposed, but the statement that the chain of imperialism broke at its weakest link was held up as Lenin's most characteristic theoretical postulate. Stalin's Fundamentals of Leninism contains a less obvious but no less important theoretical doctrine. This was that, quote, Leninism is Marxism of the era of imperialism and the proletarian revolution, end quote. On the face of this was a fairly innocuous formulation, but the corollary which Stalin did not spell out was rather more significant. It was that Marx's writing applied only to the era of capitalism. It's a common thing for Stalinists to say. In this idea, Stalin was adopting the doctrine that Bukharin had introduced in his Economics of the Transition Period, that the categories of capitalism did not exist in the time of the transition to socialism. Bukharin took up the doctrine in his 1924 essay on Lenin as Marxist, arguing that there were developments in capitalism that Marx was not familiar with because they did not exist in Marx's times, such as the formation of trusts and syndicates. This division into the Marxism of Marx and the Marxism of Lenin propounded by Stalin and Bukharin was a very convenient one for the Soviet regime. It could publish the most complete editions of Marx and Engels' work, but these would have only an academic or an antiquarian significance. They would have no bearing on any actions the regime took. These would be justified by the more flexible, quote, Leninism, end quote. A further step in the direction of separating the Soviet reality from Marxist theory came in 1925 with the, quote, debate on political economy held at the Communist Academy in Moscow. Wikipedia says the Communist Academy was a higher education establishment and research institute based in Moscow. It included scientific institutes of philosophy, history, literature, art, and language, Soviet construction and law, world economy and world politics, economics, agrarian research, as well as institutes of natural and social science. It was intended to allow Marxists to research problems independent of and implicitly in rivalry with the Academy of Sciences, which long pre-existed the October Revolution and the subsequent formation of the Soviet Union. It existed from 1918 to 1936. Back to the text. The target here were books like The Course of Political Economy, written by Bogdanov and Skvortsov-Stepanov. Let's see. Course of Political Economy by Bogdanov. Okay, not really seeing anything there. Skvortsov-Stepanov. Ivan Skvortsov-Stepanov, who lived from 1870 to 1928, was a prominent Russian Bolshevik revolutionary and Soviet politician. Ivan Ivanovich Skvortsov-Stepanov was one of the oldest participants in the Russian revolutionary movement, as well as a Marxist writer, economist, historian, and journalist. Back to the text. The target here were books like The Course of Political Economy, written by Bogdanov and Skvortsov-Stepanov, which treated the subject historically. The implication of this was that the categories of political economy were valid for more than just the capitalist period, but were found in different historical epochs. In defense, Skvortsov-Stepanov presented a well-researched paper with numerous quotations from Marx's work, showing that Marx's method had not only been abstract but also historical. Bukharin, for his part, inquired of Skvortsov-Stepanov whether Bogdanov, in his novel Red Star, used the categories of bourgeois political economy. The problem for Bukharin, Preobrazhensky, and all those who opposed the historical approach to political economy was that when Lenin had reviewed Bogdanov's short course of political economy, which treated the subject historically, he had been much in favor of Bogdanov's approach, declaring it to be, quote, exactly how one ought to expound political economy, end quote. Various ingenious pretexts were advanced to explain why Lenin could not have meant what he said. The arguments advanced by Bogdanov and Skvortsov-Stepanov were to no avail. The issue had been decided in advance, and henceforth it was a matter of Soviet doctrine that Marx's analysis in Das Kapital applied to a capitalist society only, and that the categories of political economy were valid only in bourgeois society. New section. Economic planning. If the prospects that Hilferding had held out of the seizure of 6 banks being sufficient to gain control of the national economy, then the Bolsheviks would have fallen heir to a ready-made planning system nurturing within the capitalist order. Even when this turned out not to be the case, it was still believed that a planned economy was the hallmark of a socialist system. However, now it would be necessary to create the socialist planned economy from scratch. In March 1920, Trotsky expressed his approval of the notion that workers now had to, quote, shift in accordance with a single economic plan in order from central economic organizations. On orders from central economic organizations, end quote. And Trotsky justified the militarization of labor by claiming that such a plan was already in operation. Lev Kritzman Lev Kritzman, according to Wikipedia, was a Soviet Marxian economist who became a prominent advocate of state planning in the 1920s Soviet economy. After 1929, Lev Natanovich Kritzman's views on agricultural reform were aligned with mass collectivization and dekulakization by Joseph Stalin. So back to the text. Ellen Kritzmann also advocated the need for a single economic plan in a pamphlet written at the end of 1920. How Ellen Kritzmann envisaged the planning process was, quote, the preparation of a single economic plan consisted in establishing, firstly, how much of what there is and how much can be obtained, and secondly, how much of what is needed, and the economic plan itself consists in deciding how much of what should be received, produced, prepared within the country or brought in from abroad, and the provision of each organ of the national economy with everything that organ needs to fulfill the tasks that organ has been set, end quote. Kritzmann. In January 1921, Bogdanov gave a lecture entitled, quote, The Organizational Principles of a Unified Economic System, end quote, to the First Congress of the Scientific Organization of Labor. It was a significant lecture because in it, Bogdanov formulated the principles of Soviet economic planning. Bogdanov's definition of a planned economy was an economy in which all the economy's parts are systematically coordinated on the basis of a unified and methodically elaborated economic plan. In this way, the economy as a whole would be treated as a system in the technological sense. The essence of this approach was expressed in the two propositions. 1. Every organized whole is a system of activities, unfolding in a particular environment and in constant interaction with it. Thus, society is a system of human activities in the natural environment and in a process of struggle against its resistances. 2. Every part of an organized system exists in a particular functional relationship to the whole. Thus, in society, every branch of the economy, every enterprise, every worker fulfills its own particular function. These propositions were the points of departure for establishing the equilibrium of the system and its further development. Bogdanov stressed that equilibrium came first and development second. The equilibrium of the economic system depended on there being a balance between production and distribution. Since production provided all the products for distribution, the distribution in its turn served to support production. It was possible to define the conditions for equilibrium, namely, the equilibrium of the social economy is possible where each one of its elements, by means of distribution, receives all the necessary means to fulfill its social productive functions. As a result of the interdependence of the sectors of the economy, the expansion of the economic system as a whole is subject to the, quote, law of the least, end quote, making the expansion depend on the rate of development of its most backward parts. If, say, for a new cycle of production, some of the necessary elements can be obtained in a quantity that is increased by only 2% over the previous one, but other elements can grow by 4, 6, 9%, in such a case, even the expansion of the other branches can only take place successively within the limits of 2%. If they exceeded this rate, it would be to no purpose and would probably cause a bottleneck. One finds that these arguments repeated by Bukharin in the debates about Soviet industrialization. New section: Industrialization debates. V.G. Groman and Bazarov were among the Soviet economists who were influenced by Bogdanov's argument that the economy should be seen as a unified system tending towards equilibrium and as a system of chains which could be no stronger than the weakest link. Vladimir Groman, who lived from 1874 to March 1940, was a Menshevik economist and statistician active in Gosplan, the Soviet Union's Central Economic Planning Agency, and the Central Statistical Directorate. Vladimir Bazarov was a Russian Marxist revolutionary, journalist, philosopher, and economist. Born as Vladimir Alexandrovich Rudnev, Bazarov is best remembered as a pioneer in the development of economic planning in the Soviet Union. Bazarov was one of the Russian Marxists, as Lenin dubbed the term, and was a close friend to Alexander Bogdanov. Back to the text. V.G. Groman and Bazarov were among the Soviet economists who were influenced by Bogdanov's argument that the economy should be seen as a unified system tending towards equilibrium, and as a system of change which could no longer be no stronger than the weakest link. It followed that planning should be concerned above all to ensure proportionality between the different sectors of the economy. One of the earliest ideas was that a single economic plan should take the form of a, quote, balance sheet, end quote, of the entire economy. This would constitute, in Bazarov's words, quote, a stable system of dynamic equilibrium, end quote, Bazarov. In April 1922, the work on compiling such a balance sheet, which was to serve as a basis for the single economic plan, was begun. The task, however, turned out to be much more complex than anticipated, so that when the preliminary figures were published in 1925, they were not complete enough to take the form of the projected balance sheet. In Bazarov's view, there were two distinct approaches to planning. There was the one which extrapolated from existing resources and projected these into the future, which Bazarov termed, quote, genetic, end quote, and there was the approach which set goals and targets to be attained, which he called, quote, teleological, end quote. Bazarov believed that both of these approaches were valid, though the genetic approach should predominate. Originally, these terms had no political connotations, but by the end of the 1920s, the term genetic and teleological had become part of the factional struggle between the left and right. Quote, teleology, end quote, was regarded as a term of approval for those who wished to go beyond the market framework, whereas, quote, genetic, end quote, was an abusive term for those like Bukharin who wanted to preserve the market relations of the new economic policy, NEP, which had been introduced in 1921. By 1925 to 26, Russian industrial output had regained its pre-war levels, and existing productive capacity was restored. The question then arose, how to transform the country into a socialist direction by an expansion of the industrial sector. Preobrazhensky based his approach on the way that Marx had described the means by which the resources for capitalism had been amassed in Britain by, quote, primitive accumulation, end quote. This had involved the expropriation of the peasantry, enclosures of agricultural land, and the exploitation of the colonies. These methods, Preobrazhensky stressed, were not open to Soviet Russia. Nevertheless, in, quote, primitive socialist accumulation, end quote, something of the kind must take place since the peasantry were the main source of accumulation for Soviet industrialization. Preobrazhensky argued that after the revolution, the peasantry had more resources than before because the peasantry were now less burdened by taxation and other compulsory payments to the state and the landowners. As a result, they had more effective demand for industrial goods that industry in its present state was powerless to supply. In Preobrazhensky's view, the Soviet state should use its position as the supplier of most industrial goods and, as the monopolist of foreign trade, to pump resources out of the private sector and to finance the state's investments in the expanding socialist industrial sector. To achieve this, the relationship between industry and agriculture would not be based on equal exchange. The peasants would have to pay relatively more for industrial goods than what the peasants received in return for their grain. This would provide the resources to build up industry and at a comparatively rapid pace. Peasants would benefit from rapid industrialization because rapid industrialization would increase the quantity of goods for the peasants to buy. At the same time, it would mechanize agriculture and make them more productive. For Preobrazhensky, there was a difference in principle between the nationalized industrial sector, controlled by the Soviet state on the one hand, and the private sector of peasants and capitalists on the other. Whereas in the private sector the law of value operated, in the state sector it was the law of, quote, primitive socialist accumulation, end quote. Bukharin thought that Preobrazhensky's program would alienate the peasantry and endanger the regime's survival. A regime which was at war with the peasantry could not be strong. The peasants would not produce or deliver their surplus grain without an incentive, and Preobrazhensky's, quote, non-equivalent exchange, end quote, would eliminate market incentives that the new economic policy gave peasants. It would mean a return to requisitioning. Bukharin recognized that the growth of industry would be slow, since the growth of industry would depend on the peasants' willingness to save and supply the state with food surpluses. The road to socialism would be at a, quote, snail's pace, end quote, but on the positive side, it would maintain the worker-peasant alliance. That's referred to as the Smichka. At least I believe that's what it's referred to. The Worker-Peasant Alliance in Russian was called the Smichka. Despite their differences on the pace of industrialization, both Bukharin and Preobrazhensky shared the assumption that the equilibrium of the Soviet economy must be maintained. However, by the end of the 1920s, this assumption was beginning to be questioned by Stalin. The article that Bukharin published in Pravda on the 30th of September 1928, entitled Notes of an Economist under the pretext of criticizing Trotsky, in reality is directed against Stalin and puts the case for equilibrium in the strongest terms. This article is the most, quote, technological, end quote, of Bukharin's writings of the period and significantly echoes arguments that Bogdanov had used against Preobrazhensky. Although Bukharin conceded he had regarded the science of economics as applying only to the capitalist world, and the science of the planned economy applied only to socialist society, Bukharin believed nevertheless that lessons could be drawn from the capitalist experience. An important lesson to be learnt was that successful industrialization depended on a thriving agriculture. The industry was dependent on the prosperity of the peasants. Conversely, agriculture depended on the growth of industry for its mechanization. If for the sake of, quote, pumping over, end quote, of resources from agriculture to industry, a pricing policy were introduced in favor of industry and against agriculture, the peasants would reduce their production of grain, and Bukharin warned, quote, if any branch of production regularly fails to recover that branch of production's production costs, plus a certain increment, that corresponds to a certain proportion of surplus labor, and can serve as the source of expanded reproduction, then that branch of production either stands still or regresses. Regresses with italics. Regresses. End quote. Bukharin. At the time Bukharin was writing, the Soviet regime was beset with the problem of grain collection, and Stalin was invoking the Soviet criminal code to discourage hoarding. Stalin did not readjust the state price for grain, which might have alleviated the situation, but instead embarked upon the policy of forced collectivization of agriculture. The policy was accompanied by a political campaign against the, quote, rightists, end quote, among whom Stalin numbered Bukharin. And that was the position of Trotsky as well, although whether Trotsky would have handled the rightists or whatever in the same way as Stalin might have, that's definitely, Trotsky went to his grave viewing Stalinism as a form of extreme centrism, which opposed both the left and the right of Bolshevik society, which manifested the class interest and tensions of the transitional period in a society of backwardness and isolation. New section. The end of equilibrium. In a speech made to the Conference of Marxist Agrarians in 1929. Is that a thing that you can look up? Let's see if it's a thing that has anything when you try to look it up. It doesn't look like it. Okay. I'm just burpsy. In a speech made to the Conference of Marxist Agrarians in 1929, Stalin denounced the theory of equilibrium that had hitherto been the assumption of Soviet economists. Stalin declared, quote, you know, of course, that the so-called theory of, quote, equilibrium, end quote, between the sectors of our national economy is still current among communists. This theory, of course, has nothing in common with Marxism. Nevertheless, it is a theory that is being spread by a number of people in the camp of rightists. End quote. Stalin. Stalin maintained that objectively the purpose of the theory was to defend the position of individual peasant farming, to act as a theoretical weapon in the struggle against the collective farms. In place of the theory of equilibrium, Stalin invoked the Marxist concept of, quote, expanded reproduction, end quote. Stalin pointed out that whereas Soviet industry expanded year upon year, the economy of small peasant farms did not. It not only failed to show expanded reproduction, but in the majority of cases was unable to achieve even simple reproduction. In order to make agriculture capable of expanded reproduction, it was necessary to combine the small peasant farms into large collective farms, employing machinery and scientific methods of farming. Such farms would be capable of further development and would be able to achieve expanded reproduction. Soon after this speech, Groman and Bazarov were arrested on the charge of belonging to the so-called counter-revolutionary organization of Mensheviks and of wrecking activities. The end of equilibrium in Soviet economic theory meant the adoption and practice of the concept of unbalanced growth, leading to severe bottlenecks and shortages in the years that followed. New section. Lenininsky Zbornik. Bukharin's dictum that Marx and Engels' writings only applied to the era of capitalism ensured that the Soviet regime would not feel threatened by the publication of any works penned by the founders of Marxism. One of the most important offshoots of the Socialist Academy, later Communist Academy, the Institute of Marx and Engels, presided over by the Marxist scholar David Ryazanov. The Institute's journal, Marx Engels Archive, published manuscript writings of Marx and Engels, as well as scholarly articles on the history of socialism. The drafts of Marx's letter to Ferenc Sasulich appeared in the Marx Engels Archive in 1924, and Engels' Dialectics of Nature, quote, Dialectics of Nature, end quote, in 1925. The Lenin Institute was established on Lenin's death in 1924. It was headed by Lev Kamenev, who edited the journal Lenin Miscellany, which published those of Lenin's writings that had not appeared elsewhere. Just a brief reminder of who Lev Kamenev is. Lev Kamenev lived from 1883 to 1936 and was a Russian revolutionary and Soviet politician. Lev Kamenev was born in Moscow to parents who had both been involved in revolutionary politics in the 1870s. He joined the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party in 1901 and was active in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Kamenev participated in the failed Russian Revolution of 1905. Relocating abroad in 1908, he became an early member of the Bolsheviks and a close associate of the exiled Vladimir Lenin. In 1914, Lev Kamenev was arrested upon returning to St. Petersburg and exiled to Siberia. Kamenev was able to return after the February Revolution of 1917, which overthrew the Tsarist monarchy. In 1917, Lev Kamenev served briefly as the equivalent of the first head of state of the All-Russian Congress of Soviets. Lev Kamenev disagreed with Lenin's strategy of armed uprising during the October Revolution, but nevertheless remained in a position of power after the fall of the Provisional Government. In 1919, Lev Kamenev was elected a full member of the First Politburo. During Lenin's final illness in 1923-24, Kamenev was the acting leader of the Soviet Union, forming a troika with Grigory Zinoviev and Joseph Stalin, which led to Leon Trotsky's downfall. Stalin subsequently turned against his former allies and ousted Kamenev from the Soviet leadership. Kamenev and Zinoviev would later align with Trotsky and form the United Opposition from 1926 to 1927. Along with Zinoviev, he was expelled from the party 3 times. Kamenev was arrested in 1935 following the assassination of Sergei Kirov and made a chief defendant in 1936 trial of the 16, which marked the start of the Great Purge. Lev Kamenev was found guilty during the show trial and executed by a firing squad on August 25th. So back to the text. The Lenin Institute was headed by Lev Kamenev, who edited the journal Lenin Miscellany, which published those of Lenin's writings that had not appeared elsewhere. As part of the campaign against Bukharin and the, quote, rightists, end quote, Stalin published Lenin's comments on Bukharin's Economics of the Transition Period in Lenin Miscellany in November 1929. This is intended to show that Lenin had been critical of Bukharin's ideas and even more damning that Bukharin had been influenced by Bogdanov. The downside of this maneuver was that it revealed that Lenin had not agreed with the, quote, weakest link, end quote, interpretation of the October Revolution attributed to Lenin by Stalin and Bukharin. Sure enough, the discrepancy was noticed and was the subject of an article in Pravda on the 16th of December 1929. Stalin, however, replied immediately, claiming that Bukharin's, quote, weakest link, end quote, theory was entirely different from Lenin's. In the September of 1929, December 1930 issues, In the September 1929 and December 1930 issues of Lenin Miscellany, there appeared the collection of manuscripts known as the, quote, philosophical notebooks, end quote. Nothing was published in this journal that Stalin had not approved, and as the publication of Lenin's comments on Bukharin's book illustrates, Stalin used the journal for political purposes. The question thus arises, what did Stalin want to accomplish by publishing Lenin's notes on philosophy? The obvious answer to this is that it contributed to the Lenin cult that Stalin had fostered by showing Lenin as an adept of Marxist theory. This was something not generally accepted since, as Bukharin pointed out in his article, Lenin is Marxist, Lenin was widely thought of, both inside and outside the party, as a man of action, but not as a Marxist theoretician. In this context, the notes on philosophy could be held up as proof that Lenin was a master of Hegelian dialectics. But beyond this, Stalin wanted to show that in the development of Marxism there was a distinct Leninist stage. This was in line with the Soviet orthodoxy that Leninism was Marxism of the era of imperialism and proletarian revolution. The idea, however, was resisted by David Ryazanov, the director of the Marx and Engels Institute. David Ryazanov and his institute consequently came under attack for their failure to give Lenin his due. To these criticisms, Ryazanov replied, quote, that it was only after he became acquainted with the correspondence of Marx and Engels did Lenin apply himself to a more profound study of materialist dialectics, and that therefore there could be no talk of Leninism as a new, higher method of scientific investigation as compared with the method of Marxism, that one could only speak of the dialectical method of Marx, Engels, and Lenin. End quote, Ryazanov. Ryazanov's principled stand had dire consequence. Ryazanov was replaced as director of the Marx and Engels Institute by V.V. Adoratsky, and his institute was merged with the Lenin Institute to form the Marx, Engels, Lenin Institute attached to the Central Committee of the Communist Party, thus placing it firmly under Stalin's control. Wikipedia says Vladimir Adoratsky lived from 1878 to 1945 and was a Russian revolutionary, Soviet historian, academic, and Marxist philosopher. Back to the text. Ryazanov was replaced as director of the Marx and Engels Institute by V.V. Adoratsky, and his institute was merged with the Lenin Institute to form the Marx, Engels, and Lenin Institute attached to the Central Committee of the Communist Party, thus placing it firmly under Stalin's control. It emerges from what Ryazanov said that the impulse for Lenin to commence the study of Hegelian philosophy at the outbreak of the First World War was the reading of the Marx-Engels correspondence. Moreover, this correspondence established the continuity between Marx and Engels on the one hand and Lenin on the other. Lenin copied out Marx and Engels' words and absorbed their opinions. As Ryazanov argued, in this situation there could be no suggestion of a distinct Leninist stage of Marxism. Consequently, although Lenin's notes on the Marx-Engels correspondence form an integral whole with the, quote, philosophical notebooks, end quote, only the, quote, philosophical notebooks, end quote, were published in Leninsky Zbornik, or Lenin Miscellany, and later in Lenin's collected works. Lenin's notes on the Marx-Engels correspondence were published only much later under Khrushchev in 1956. But if reading the Marx-Engels correspondence could not be given as the reason for Lenin's philosophical studies in 1914, what other explanation could there be? The explanation was provided by Adoratsky in the preface to the second installment of the, quote, philosophical notebooks, end quote, in December 1930. It was that, quote, Lenin's enormous contribution consists in the fact that Lenin rescued dialectics from the simplification, the vulgarization, the transformation into sophism, as was the case with the renegades of the Second International, Kautsky, van der Velde, Otto Bauer, and others, and reconstructing it in the form that it had with Marx. Adoratsky. The reference person, Emil van der Velde. who lived from 1866 to 1938, was a Belgian socialist politician nicknamed, quote, the boss, end quote. Van der Velde was a leading figure in the Belgian Labour Party and in international socialism. Back to the text. This explanation of Adaratsky's is the origin of the interpretation of the, quote, philosophical notebooks, end quote, as the regeneration of dialectical materialism, which had been vulgarized by the theoreticians of the Second International. This interpretation is still current today, though it is not history, but a piece of Soviet ideology approved and perhaps even invented by Stalin. I'm very curious what this is making me think of. I know the philosophical notebooks are important for people like Raya Dunayevsky and C.L.R. James. I wonder if it could be said that they hold to this interpretation of the philosophical notebooks, but I'm not sure. New section. Istapart. How history is written, especially the history of the Bolshevik Party and how the Bolshevik Party came to power, was important to the Soviet regime from the very start of its existence. There were two main stages in the early interpretations of the October Revolution. The first stage was from 1918 to 1920 and coincided with the period of the Civil War, when the Bolshevik government was hard pressed by internal and external adversaries and needed to project a sympathetic image to potential friends. It wanted to refute the charge that it had come to power by coup d'etat. The work which embodies the required interpretation of the October Revolution is Trotsky's pamphlet From October to Brest-Litovsk, which was written while Trotsky was attending the peace negotiations with the Germans and Austrians at Brest-Litovsk. From October to Brest-Litovsk, Trotsky is adamant that the process that brought the Bolsheviks to power was not a coup d'etat. On the contrary, taking power was a measure that was forced upon the Bolsheviks by the circumstances and by the insistence of the workers. One finds the same interpretation in John Reed's famous book, 10 Days That Shook the World. I'd recommend the movie Reds. That's about John Reed and Louise Bryant, played by Warren Beatty and Diane Keaton. I recommend that movie. It's a good movie. I don't know how historically accurate a lot of it is, and I haven't seen it since I've learned more about the period, but it's a good movie. One finds the same interpretation in John Reed's famous book, 10 Days That Shook the World, in which the Bolshevik leadership is harangued by a, quote, rough worker, end quote, to take power into their hands. Trotsky's pamphlet was the prototype for later programmatic works that set out an official interpretation of events that all other works were expected to follow. I think there was big pushback. I'm not sure. There's a book about it. I think it's called, like, I'm not exactly sure what it's called. It might be called I think it's called Trotsky's Challenge. I had to write about it because I had to write like a historiography of a topic in Soviet history for a Soviet history course, and I wrote a historiography of all the Anglophone works on Trotsky since Max Eastman's first publication in 1926. And there's a book by, I don't know if it's Frederick Corney, might be his name. It's called Trotsky's Challenge. But I think that book is about the polemics that were initiated by in the Soviet Union by Trotsky's later work, 1924's Lessons of October. Apparently that book caused a huge stink in the Soviet Union. But that's what the book is about. So I don't know if there will be anything in this piece about Trotsky's Lessons of October from 1924 in comparison to this earlier work, which is titled From October to the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, or October to Brest-Litovsk. But I don't know, but it'd be interesting. So where was I? Back to the text. Back to reading. The second stage is from 1920 onwards, by which time the tide of the Civil War had turned in the Reds' favor, and when the Second Congress of the Communist International met in Moscow in the summer of 1920. Hopes were high that the Russian Revolution might be exported to Western Europe. In these circumstances, the, quote, defensive, end quote, interpretation of the October Revolution was abandoned in favor of one that emphasized the role of the Bolshevik Party in organizing and leading the seizure of power in October 1917. The new doctrine was voiced by Lenin in his pamphlet, Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. This was that the October Revolution had been successful due to the organization and iron discipline of the Bolshevik Party. It was a formula that Lenin recommended to the international communist movement. In 1920, there was formed Istpart. Let's see. The Commission for the Study and Publication of Materials on the History of the Bolshevik Party and the October Revolution. Istpart. Wikipedia says, Istpart, the Commission on History of the October Revolution and the Russian Communist Party Bolsheviks, was also known as Istpart. Was a research institute that collected, processed, archived, and published history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the October Revolution. Back to the text. In 1920, there was formed Istpart, the Commission for the Study and Publication of Materials on the History of the Bolshevik Party and the October Revolution. Istpart's chairman was M.S. Olminsky, a veteran revolutionary who had published a historical work on the origins of the Russian absolutist state and had edited a collection of memoirs of pioneers of social democracy in Russia. Wikipedia says Mikhail Olminsky, who lived from 1863 to 1933, was a prominent Russian Bolshevik, particularly involved with party history and also an active literary theorist and publicist. Olminsky, this is one of those things, it's like a real long introduction. It's like a full biography. But yeah, I'm not going to read all that. Istpart's chairman was M.S. Olminsky, a veteran revolutionary who had published a historical work on the origins of the Russian absolutist state and had edited a collection of memoirs of pioneers of social democracy in Russia. Party history was a field too sensitive to be left to historians and tended to be dominated by party functionaries like Nevsky, who we've already looked up, and Y.A. Yakovlev. And E.M. Yaroslavsky. Wikipedia says Yakov Yakovlev, who lived from 1896 to 1938, was a Soviet politician and statesman who played a central role in the forced collectivization of agriculture in the 1920s. He had more than a merely academic role. And as far as this guy looks like he has a little more of an extended Wikipedia page, but Yamelin Yaroslavsky lived from 1878 to 1943 and was a Bolshevik revolutionary, Communist Party functionary, journalist, and historian. An atheist and anti-religious polemicist, Yaroslavsky served as editor of the atheist satirical magazine Bezboznik, The Godless, and led the League of the Militant Godless organization. Yemelyan Yaroslavsky also headed the anti-religious committee of the Central Committee. In Yemelyan Yaroslavsky's book, How Gods and Goddesses Are Born, Live and Die, published in 1923, Yemelyan Yaroslavsky argued that religion was born under man, lived under man, and would die under communism. Back to the text. Party history was a field too sensitive to be left to historians and tended to be dominated by party functionaries like Nevsky, Yemelyan Yaroslavsky, and Yakov Yakovlev and Yemelyan Yaroslavsky. From its Istpart's inception, Istpart set about establishing a monopoly on all sources related to Istpart's. From Istpart's inception, Istpart set out about establishing a monopoly on all sources relating to Istpart's field of interest, so that Istpart's version of events could not be challenged by alternative interpretations. Istpart's journal, Proletarskaya Revolutionsia, Proletarian Revolution, became one of the main sources for materials on the Russian revolutionary movement and on the October Revolution of 1917 in particular. Of course, the new interpretation called for the publication of a new programmatic history of the October Revolution. The task of editing this work was entrusted by Olminsky to Trotsky. The actual writing was done by Yakovlev, the resulting work being a short pamphlet entitled On the Historical Significance of October, published in 1922. I don't think it's too much of a generic title for me to find something on it. Wait, maybe if I type in 1922. Oh, man. Okay, well, can't find anything on it. On the Historical Significance of October, published in 1922, was the first work to deal with the February as well as the October Revolution. Yakovlev contrasted these two revolutions, showing that in February the workers had been unable to seize power because of the workers' lack of organization, whereas October had been a successful proletarian revolution because of the leadership of the Bolshevik Party. The lesson for Proletkult, the workers' opposition, and any other groups which believed in workers' autonomy was clear. To be successful, the labor movement needed party leadership. A key function of the history of the October Revolution was in emphasizing the importance of members of the party leadership. Prominent figures such as Lenin, Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev were attributed important roles in bringing the Bolsheviks to power. Thus, the question was not, quote, who played important parts in the October Revolution, end quote. It was, quote, what important roles in the October Revolution did so-and-so play? Trotsky was a major beneficiary of such honorific attributions until 1924, when Trotsky turned the convention on its head by denying that Zinoviev and Kamenev had played significant roles in the October Revolution, undermined their positions in the party leadership. The publication of Lenin's writings was indispensable if events were to be interpreted from a Leninist point of view. K.N. Ostrokova The publication of Lenin's writings was indispensable if events were to be interpreted from a Leninist point of view. K.N. Ostrokova, for example, in recalling her work for Istpart, revealed the method employed when she had written a series of articles for Proletarskaya Revolutionitsa, I don't know if I'm saying that right, on Lenin's campaign against the boycott of the Second and Third Dumas. This is an important subject because it formed part of the argument in Lenin's left-wing communism and infantile disorder. According to Ostrokova, quote, I was worried about my ability to expound these complex themes correctly. M.S. Olminsky gave me advice. First of all, study Lenin's works, Lenin's pronouncements on the question of intra-party struggle in these years, ... I remember that in writing the article, quote, Social Democracy and the Elections to the Third State Duma, end quote, I took my guidance chiefly from Lenin's article, quote, against the boycott, end quote. End quote. Ostrukova. By structuring historical events around Lenin's writings in the way Ostrukova describes, there was inevitably produced a version of history proving that events had confirmed the correctness of Lenin's views. The logic of the situation eventually led to the history of the Bolshevik Party and the October Revolution becoming a kind of exegesis on Lenin's writings. The culmination of the process came in 1928 when Istpart was incorporated into the Lenin Institute. As Olminsky explained, quote, the question of a merger arose inevitably. It was impossible to conceive of the history of the party without Lenin or the history of Lenin without the party, end quote. New section, Pokrovsky. The establishment of Istpart had the effect of designating an area of special ideological significance and removing it from the province of academic historical study. The people on the staff of Istpart, therefore, who were not chosen for their historical scholarship, but for their political reliability, a fact noted with some annoyance in 1923 by N.A. Roscoe. Who, though a former Menshevik, was a historian of some standing and one with an interest in the history of the Russian revolutionary movement. According to Wikipedia, Nikolai Alexandrovich Roscoe lived from 1868 to 1927 and was a Russian historian who became an active revolutionary in the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. In 1905, Roscoe joined the Bolshevik faction of the RSDLP at the 5th Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Roscoe was elected as a full member of the Central Committee. However, by 1907, he had fallen out with Lenin, who maintained for him an enduring hatred. Back to the text. The people on the staff of Istpart, therefore, were not chosen for their historical scholarship, but for their political reliability, a fact noted with some annoyance in 1923 by N.A. Roscoe, who, though a former Menshevik, was a historian of some standing and one with an interest in the history of the Russian revolutionary movement. By the same token, however, the remainder of Russian history was left for scholarly study, including the social and economic conditions which led up to the 1917 revolution. Political control over this area was only established in 1931 following Stalin's letter to Proletskaya Revolutsiya. Pokrovsky was fortunate in his polemic with Trotsky because in the following year, sorry, one second. Wikipedia says, Mikhail Pokrovsky was a Russian Marxist historian who lived from 1868 to 1932. He was a revolutionary and a Soviet public and political figure. One of the earliest professionally trained historians to join the Russian revolutionary movement, Mikhail Pokrovsky is regarded as the most influential Soviet historian of the 1920s and was known as the, quote, head of the Marxist historical school in the USSR. Pokrovsky was neither a Bolshevik nor a Menshevik for nearly a decade prior to the October Revolution of 1917, instead living in European exile as an independent radical close to philosopher Alexander Bogdanov. Following the Bolshevik seizure of power, Pokrovsky rejoined the Bolshevik Party and moved to Moscow, where Mikhail Pokrovsky became the deputy chief of the Soviet government's new Department of Education, the People's Commissariat of Enlightenment. Pokrovsky played a leading role in the early Soviet educational establishment, editing several of the major historical journals of the period, and guiding the restructuring of the higher education system and its personnel as head of the Institute of Red Professors. Mikhail Pokrovsky was the author of influential and pioneering works of Russian history, presenting semi-official reinterpretations of the Russian past presented through the lens of class struggle and the progress of history through concrete stages of development. Pokrovsky was harshly critical of the nature of the multinational Tsarist empire and de-emphasized the personal role played by individuals such as the modernizing Tsar Peter the Great. So that's Mikhail Pokrovsky. Back to the text. Pokrovsky was fortunate in his polemic with Trotsky because in the following year Trotsky fell out of favor with the party leadership. Pokrovsky's articles against Trotsky's conception of Russian historical development merged into the general anti-Trotsky campaign. Because Pokrovsky had argued in favor of Russia as having an autonomous economic development, one not dominated by foreign capital, Pokrovsky's articles against Trotsky were held to lend weight to the case for the building of socialism in one country. This impression was reinforced in 1927 when two students of the Institute of Red Professors, Alipov and Svetkov, asked Stalin to clarify what his position was on the origins of the Russian autocracy. Yeah, I'm not really seeing anything for that person. And Svetkov, this is how you'd say it. Not finding anything for either of these people. So, but it says, this impression was reinforced in 1927. Okay, no, I already read that. Wikipedia says the Institute of Red Professors of the All-Union Communist Party was an institute of graduate-level education in the Marxist social sciences located in the Orthodox convent of the Passion, Moscow. And back to the text. This impression was reinforced in 1927 when two students of the Institute of Red Professors, Alipov and Svetkov, asked Stalin to clarify what his position was on the origins of the Russian autocracy. They had noticed that in his speech at the 10th Party Congress, Stalin had said that the centralized state in Russia had not been formed by the economic development of the country, but as a means of defense against the Mongols and other Eastern people. Did this mean that Trotsky was right when he asserted that in its development the Russian state had overtaken economics? Stalin replied, quote, as for the theory of the, quote, autocratic structure, end quote, I must say that basically I do not share Comrade Trotsky's theory, whereas I consider Comrade Pokrovsky's theory correct in the main, although it is not without its overstatements in simplifying the economic explanation of the rise of the autocracy, end quote. Stalin. This passage was omitted from Stalin's works, the official works in italics, the published works, but it was referred to in a report of Pokrovsky's address to the First Congress of Marxist Historians, published in the journal Historique Marxiste. In his address, let me see if there's anything for this. Congress of Marxist Historians. This looks like it's the journal that it's being referred to. The Marxist Historian was a Soviet scientific journal published in Moscow between 1926 and 1941, merged with the, quote, historical journal, end quote. the first historical magazine widely covering issues of national and world history, including the countries of the East. The journal published research articles, reviews, documents, and official materials. So, back to the text. This passage was omitted from Stalin's works, but it was referred to in a report of Pokrovsky's address to the First Congress of Marxist Historians published in the journal Historic Marxist. In Pokrovsky's address, Pokrovsky confessed that in the explanation of historical events, Pokrovsky tended to overstate the economic factor, and that, quote, this was noticed by Comrade Stalin during the discussion between Pokrovsky and Trotsky. Recognizing Trotsky's scheme as completely un-Marxist, Comrade Stalin noted the correctness of Pokrovsky's scheme, only pointing out that it suffered from some simplification, consisting in the exaggeration of the role of the economic factor, end quote. Pokrovsky. N.N. Vanag. One second. In 1925, N.N. can't find anything for Vanag. In 1925, N.N. Vanag, one of Trotsky's students, published the monograph Finance, Capital in Russia Before the World War. Vanag took as Vanag's starting point Lenin's conception of imperialism as being the merger of finance or bank capital with industrial capital. This merger had taken place in Russia, but whereas the industry had been Russian, the finance capital had been foreign. Russian monopoly capitalism, therefore, was not an independent system, but more a link in a chain of a more powerful system, that of Anglo-French-Belgian finance capital. According to Vanag, foreign capital controlled 3/4 of the whole banking system, and of this the largest share was in the hands of the French banking consortium, 53.2%. The Germans controlled 36.4% and the British 10%. That is, the Entente powers controlled 33.6% and the Germans 36.4% of all foreign investment in Russian industry. Vanag's study was followed by others which confirmed Vanag's findings, the only differences between them being the precise extent of Russia's dependence on foreign capital. Pokrovsky fully accepted Vanag's findings and adjusted Pokrovsky's conception of modern Russian history accordingly. But if Pokrovsky saw Vanag's work chiefly as a means of perfecting Pokrovsky's own historical conceptions, others were more sensitive to its political implications. In 1928, at the first conference of Marxist historians, P.O. Gorin can't find anything on P.O. Gorin. In 1928, at the first conference of Marxist historians, P.O. Gorin expressed what must have been in the minds of many delegates. P.O. Gorin pointed out, quote, the views of Vanag on the role of foreign capital in Russia are close to those of Trotsky. Trotsky's views on the role of foreign capital in Russia, in the preface of his book 1905, Trotsky, in the preface of his book 1905, also ignores the role of indigenous capital in Russia. The ideas of Vanag and Trotsky are exactly alike, end quote. P.O. Gorin. Other participants in the conference recommended that Vanag should take the approach Lenin had in his The Development of Capitalism in Russia, focusing on indigenous rather than foreign investment in the Russian economy. Eventually, the Trotskyist label began to be applied to Pokrovsky himself. It occurred in 1931 in a chapter of the History of Communist Party edited by Yaroslavsky. It was asserted that, quote, in denying the independent character of Russian imperialism, Pokrovsky, Vanag, and Kritzman have regarded Russia as a colony of French and English imperialism, end quote. There then followed accusations of a, quote, revision of Leninism, end quote, Trotskyist prose, end quote, and other political abuse which Pokrovsky rejected as having no justification. Vanag himself in 1932 had published a letter in Historic Marxist, in which Vanag said that Vanag considered it necessary to, quote, condemn most decisively the point of view which presents Tsarist Russia as a colony of Western European imperialist countries. This theory serves as a basis for the Trotskyist thesis that the building of socialism is impossible in our country, end quote. Vanag. Stalin made his presence felt by Soviet historians in a dramatic and forceful manner in October 1931 when Proletarskaya Revolutsiya published Stalin's letter to the editorial board of the journal. Stalin's letter, entitled Some Questions Concerning the History of Bolshevism, complained that the journal had published an article by a certain Slutsky, which suggested that Lenin might have underestimated the danger of centrism in the German Social Democratic Party. I don't know. I'm looking for something that says Slutsky, but I can't find anything. There were some historical matters, Stalin asserted, which were axiomatic truths and were not subject to discussion. Any attempt to do so was, in his opinion, the smuggling of, quote, Trotskyist contraband, end quote, into historical literature. Stalin's letter singled out for special criticism Yaroslavsky's party history, in which Pokrovsky had been criticized. It was Pokrovsky's opponents who now found themselves under a cloud. In May 1934, the Soviet government recommended that school textbooks should be produced which presented their factual material in a chronological order and avoided, quote, abstract sociological schemes, end quote. A number of groups were established to draw up outlines for the proposed textbooks, Vanag being put in charge of the group concerned with the history of the USSR. In August 1934, the outlines are read and commented upon by a panel consisting of Stalin, Bogdanov, and Kirov. Bogdanov was the head of the Moscow Soviet, I believe, at the time when he was assassinated. I want to look up Bogdanov real quick because he's important. The Zhdanov Doctrine is what I was really looking for. The Zhdanov Doctrine was a Soviet cultural doctrine developed by Central Committee Secretary Andrei Zhdanov in 1946. The main principle of the Zhdanov Doctrine was often summarized by the phrase, quote, the only conflict that is possible in Soviet culture is the conflict between good and best, end quote. Zhdanovism soon became a Soviet cultural policy, meaning the Soviet artists, writers, and intelligentsia in general had to conform to the party line in their creative works. Under this policy, artists who failed to comply with the government's wishes risked persecution. The policy remained in effect until the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953. So, back to the text. In August of 1934, the outlines were read and commented upon by a panel consisting of Stalin, Zhdanov, and Kirov. The panel found that Vanag's outline was unsatisfactory in a number of ways, including the rather surprising one that, quote, the dependent role both of Russian Tsarism and Russian capitalism on that of Western Europe, remains unexplained, end quote. Vanag was to pay dearly for this oversight and was shot as a, quote, enemy of the people, end quote. New section. Russia's colonial status. The report of the jury for the history textbook competition was published in Pravda on the 22nd of August 1937. It was stated that the authors had in the main complied with the guidelines and avoided abstract sociological schemes, but among the shortcomings which remained, a prominent defect was that, quote, the Stalin thesis that Russia was beaten, quote, because of its military backwardness, because of its cultural backwardness, because of its governmental backwardness, because of its industrial backwardness, because of its agricultural backwardness, end quote, which provides one of the most important keys to Russian history in the last centuries, has not been understood by several authors of the textbooks, end quote. The report went on to say that if Russia's backwardness was not understood, the part played by Soviet power in transforming Russia from a poor and weak country into a rich and powerful country would not be appreciated. Now, apparently the theme of Russian backwardness, which had been associated with Trotsky until 1930, was to be attributed to Stalin. In the same year as the jury reported, Stalin drew up an outline for the projected textbook on the history of the Russian Communist Party. Symptomatically, Stalin was especially anxious that the authors of the textbook should mention the, quote, petty bourgeois and, quote, nature of the country in order to explain the great variety of currents and fractions within the party and in the working class as a whole against which it was necessary to wage an unrelenting struggle. The published version of The History of the Russian Communist Party, a short course, which appeared in 1938, duly stressed Russia's backwardness with the assertion. Let me look up the short course real quick. The History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Bolsheviks. Short course. Translated to English under the title History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Bolsheviks. Short course. Is a textbook on the history of the All-Union Communist Party Bolsheviks. First published in 1938, colloquially known as the Short Course, it became the most widely disseminated book during the time, until 1952, that Joseph Stalin served as the General Secretary of the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party Bolsheviks, and one of the most important works elucidating Marxism-Leninism. I'm going to read the overview of this book. The book was commissioned by Stalin in 1935. Regarding the motives for compiling the short course, Robert Service quoted a Bolshevik official who said there was a need for a book which, quote, instead of the Bible, end quote, would, quote, give a rigorous answer to the many important questions, end quote. At the time, the party was concerned with the abundance of publications about the AUCP's history and sought to have a single, simple, and authoritative book on the subject. The book was written by a team of historians and party members, with the principal authors being Wilhelm Knorin, Peter Pospelov, and Yemelyan Yaroslavsky. Trotsky wrote the chapter about dialectical materialism. In 1937, a draft of the short course was submitted to Stalin, who in turn requested several revisions to the text, including more historical background. On the 16th of April, the Politburo decreed that Knorin, Pospelov, and Yaroslavsky would be relieved from all their other party obligations for a period of 4 months in order to complete the short course. Between the 8th of September and the 17th of September 1938, Pospelov, Yaroslavsky, Molotov, and Andrei Zhdanov. Knorin was arrested in the Great Purge and executed on the 29th of July 1938, met daily with Stalin in Stalin's office at the Kremlin to make the last edits to the manuscript. The first chapter appeared in Pravda on the 9th of September 1938, and the rest of the text was published in serial form. The last chapter of the 19th of September. On that day, the Politburo decided to have a first edition of 6 million copies to be sold at a particularly low price, 3 rubles a copy, equivalent to the price of a liter and a half of milk at the time. On the 1st of October, the book was released. On the 14th of November, the Central Committee issued a resolution on conduct of party propaganda in connection with the publication of the short course, stating it, quote, ends all arbitrariness and confusion in the presentation of party history, end quote, and turning the book into a mandatory reading in the curriculum of all university students and attendance of party schools. Until Stalin's death in March 1953, the short course was reprinted 301 times and had 42,816,000 copies issued in Russia alone. In addition, it was translated to 66 other languages. In Hungary, 530,000 copies were printed between 1948 and 1950. In Czechoslovakia, over 652,000 copies were printed from 1950 to 1954. The short course was the most widely disseminated work in Stalin's time, and no communist publication broke its record until quotations from Chairman Mao. In 1956, Nikita Khrushchev formally repudiated the short course in his On the Cult of Personality and Its Consequences speech. A new authoritative history of the party, written by a team headed by Boris Ponomarov, was published in 1962 under the name The History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So back to the text. The published version of the History of the Russian Communist Party Bolsheviks, a short course which appeared in 1938, duly stressed Russia's backwardness with the assertion, quote, that Russia entered the imperialist war on the side of the Entente. Was not accidental. It should be borne in mind that before 1914, the most important branches of Russian industry were in the hands of foreign capitalists, chiefly those of France, Great Britain, and Belgium, that is, the Entente countries. All these circumstances, in addition to the thousands of millions borrowed by the Tsar from France and Britain in loans, changed Tsardom to British and French imperialism and converted Russia into a tributary, a semi-colony of those countries, end quote. History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolsheviks, short course. This idea was, of course, consistent with the theory of the, quote, weakest link, end quote, which also was reproduced in the short course. This stated that, quote, Lenin showed that it is just this unevenness of development of capitalism that gives rise to imperialist wars, which undermine the strength of imperialism and make it possible to break the front of imperialism at its weakest point, end quote. History of the Communist Party, Soviet Union, Bolsheviks, the short course. New section, the short course. The context in which the short course appeared was the aftermath of the forced collectivization of agriculture, the industrialization of the country with enormous human and material cost, and, most recently, the purges which had destroyed a great part of the old intelligentsia. A climate of fear and suspicion pervaded all walks of life, encouraged by calls for vigilance in the face of all-pervasive internal wreckers and saboteurs. The short course was designed to provide Soviet propagandists with the, quote, encyclopedia of Marxism-Leninism, end quote, to instruct them in what their attitudes to the history of the recent past should be. Lack of this kind of political tempering had led to members of the intelligentsia falling into the clutches of foreign spies and their Trotskyist, Bukharinist, and bourgeois nationalist agents. An article in Pravda on the 15th of November 1938 set out the objectives that the short course was meant to achieve. The first of these was that it was meant to replace all previous textbooks on the subject and put an end to the existence of different interpretations of the history of the Communist Party. The short course would be the version approved by the party's Central Committee and thus be the official version of events. The Pravda article explained that an important feature of the short course was that in propaganda it would put an end to the artificial division into Marxism and Leninism that had come about over the past few years. Henceforth, the doctrine would be referred to as Marxism-Leninism. In other words, Stalin was eradicating the distinction that he and Bukharin had created in 1924 to allow the emergence of a specifically Soviet approach to economics. In the circumstances of 1938, the change could only have symbolic significance. It signaled a new stage in Marxism which called for a new definition of Leninism. This was, quote, Leninism is the furthest development of Marxism in the new conditions of the class struggle of the proletariat. the Marxism of the epoch of imperialism and proletarian revolution, the Marxism of the epoch of the victory of socialism in 1/6 of the world, end quote. Short course. The Leninism of the new stage was, quote, active Leninism, end quote, and an example of this kind of Leninism was the collectivization of agriculture. A feature of Marxism-Leninism was that, in addition to the short course, propagandists were encouraged to refer to the first-hand sources of Marxism. There were the works of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin. The doctrine of Marxism-Leninism placed Stalin on a par with Marx, Engels, and Lenin. This did not mean, however, any radical break with the existing practice of Soviet Marxism to base itself on Lenin's interpretation of Marx's doctrines. See Marcuse, 1971, pages 38 to 9. The encouragement to read works of the four great theoreticians of Marxism, from, of course, the perspective of, quote, Marxism-Leninism, end quote, meant that there should be suitable editions of these works readily available, that there are not prompted criticism of the Institute of Marx, Engels, and Lenin. Adoratsky was contrite in the fact of the shortcomings of his institute. Adoratsky explained that the followers of the wreckers in David Ryazanov, had been expelled, but that the Institute had still been unable to fulfill its functions satisfactorily. The Institute was brought under the direct control of the Party Central Committee. The Pravda article stated that the approach of the short course to historical events would be impersonal. It would eschew the biographical approach common in other works and avoid reference to individuals. In fact, the short course did not adhere consistently to this principle and singled out people for special praise or more frequently for condemnation. But of course it was convenient not to refer to those individuals who had fallen victim to the reign of terror, which was still being conducted as the book was being published. According to the Pravda article, an aim of the short course was to avoid simplification or vulgarization in its exposition. It intended to avoid the schematism characteristic of the Pokrovsky school, which recounted events in a distorted way, viewing events from the perspective of the present day rather than the context of contemporary conditions. This was a laudable aim, but the approach adopted by the short course was the exact opposite. It was in fact simplification, vulgarization, and the evaluation of events from the perspective of the late 1930s. This was unavoidable because the book was intended for a wide audience, primarily the new Soviet intelligentsia which was emerging to replace the one that had been destroyed in the purges. The book was distributed in tens of millions of copies. This is a manual which told that cohort how to think. It was written in unambiguous terms, so there could be no doubt about whom one should be for and whom one should be against. New section. Content. The short course was for its central figures Lenin and Stalin, and for the later sections Stalin alone. Only Lenin and Stalin have right on their side. Other protagonists and currents of opinion are regarded as enemies or wreckers. Trotsky, Bukharin, and their supporters are never acknowledged to have made any positive contribution to the success of the Bolsheviks and are presented as inveterate saboteurs and traitors. This implacable attitude is projected backwards even to the opening sections of the short course, to the way the Narodniki are treated. The Narodniki are presented as a major ideological force, though no actual Narodnik or work of Narodism is mentioned. The first fact revealed about the Narodniki is that the Narodniki were, quote, opponents of Marxism, end quote. Consequently, quote, Narodism had to be completely smashed ideologically if the further spread of Marxism and the creation of a social democratic party were to be assured, end quote. This schematic presentation of events has very little relation to reality. Quote, Narodism, end quote, in the sense used by the short course never existed. As the introduction to the short course explains, the history of the Communist Party is a succession of struggles against Narodniki, Mensheviks, anarchists, and within the party itself against Trotskyists, Bukharinists, and other anti-Leninist groups. Characteristic of the short course's treatment of these groupings and individuals was the attribution to them of exaggerated views which they did not hold, thus making the Leninist views seem reasonable by comparison. This was the case in dealing with Bogdanov, Lunacharsky, and Bazarov. Quote, these people, end quote, the short course asserted, quote, claimed that in the main they were Marxists, but they wanted to, quote, improve, end quote, Marxism by ridding Marxism of certain of Marxism's fundamental principles. In reality, these people were hostile to Marxism, for these people tried to undermine Marxism's theoretical foundations, although these people hypocritically denied their hostility to Marxism and two-facedly continued to style themselves Marxists. The danger of this hypocritical criticism lay in the fact that it was calculated to deceive rank-and-file members of the party and might lead them astray. The more hypocritical grew this criticism, which aimed at undermining the theoretical foundations of Marxism, the more dangerous it was to the party, for the more it merged with the general campaign of the reactionaries against the party, against the revolution. Some of the intellectuals who had deserted Marxism went so far as to advocate the founding of a new religion. These were known as, quote, God seekers and, quote, God builders, end quote, end quote. History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolsheviks, the short course. The readers of the short course were unlikely to have read Bogdanov's Techtology or Lunacharsky's Religion and Socialism, and so would not be in a position to question the tendentious and garbled version of events. This tendentious and garbled version of events. When I typed in Lunacharsky's Religion and Socialism, what came up for Wikipedia was God building. And Wikipedia says, God building is an idea proposed by some prominent early Marxists in the Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Inspired by Auguste Comte's Religion of Humanity, the concept had some precedent in the French Revolution with the cult of reason. The idea proposed that in place of the abolition of religion, there should be a meta-religious context in which religions were viewed primarily in terms of the psychological and social effect of ritual, myth, and symbolism, in which attempted to harness the force for pro-communist aims, both by creating new ritual and symbolism and by reinterpreting existing ritual and symbolism in a socialist context. In contrast to Leninist atheism, the God builders took an official position of agnosticism. Back to the text. The readers of the short course were unlikely to have read Bogdanov's Techtology or Lunacharsky's Religion and Socialism, and so would not be in a position to question this tendentious and garbled version of events. What added some credibility to the short course's characterization of Bogdanov and his associates was the quasi-sociological explanation of the intellectual currents of the post-1905 period. This was, quote, the defeat of the revolution of 1905 started a process of disintegration and degeneration in the ranks of the fellow travelers of the revolution. Degenerate and decadent tendencies grew particularly marked among the intelligentsia. The fellow travelers who came from the bourgeois camp to join the movement during the upsurge of the revolution deserted the party in the days of reaction, end quote. History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolshevik short course. According to the short course, it was this decadent movement which gave rise to the ideas of Bogdanov, Lunacharsky, Bazarov, and others. The grain of truth in this explanation is that quite often the intellectuals who joined the revolutionary movement in 1905 left it when the movement was defeated. What is not true is that Bogdanov and his friends were part of this phenomenon. On the contrary, the party school they ran in Capri and Bologna were designed to make good the loss of the intellectuals who had deserted the workers' movement. A mark of how influential the short course became is that one can still come across the, quote, decadent, end quote, explanation of Bogdanov's and Lunacharsky's ideas in Western works to the present day. New section, Dialectical and Historical Materialism. The passage on Bogdanov is an important one in the short course because it is a preliminary to the section in Chapter 4 entitled Dialectical and Historical Materialism, written by Stalin. Here, over 30 pages, Stalin sets out the theoretical side of Marxism as Stalinism believes it ought to be understood. According to Dialectical and Historical Materialism, according to Wikipedia, Dialectical and Historical Materialism by Joseph Stalin is a central text within the Soviet Union's political theory of Marxism-Leninism. Dialectical and Historical Materialism appeared as a chapter in the short history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which drew heavily from the philosophical work of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and Vladimir Lenin. It describes the Bolshevik Party's official doctrine on dialectical materialism and historical materialism. I'm going to read real quick what it says, the synopsis. Stalin's writing is systematically presented and divided into three parts. Part 1, outline of the Marxist dialectical method in contrast to metaphysics. A, nature is a unified whole. B, nature is in perpetual motion. C, natural quantitative change leads to qualitative change. D, natural phenomenon possess internal contradictions as part of their struggle, leading to revolutionary rather than reformist change. Stalin relates this to capitalism by stating that, quote, the transition from capitalism to socialism and the liberation of the working class from the yoke of capitalism cannot be effected by slow changes by reforms, but only by a qualitative change of the capitalist system, by revolution, end quote. Part 2, outline of the Marxist philosophical materialism in contrast to idealism. A, the world is materialistic in nature. B, being is objective reality because it is material. Thus thinking is a reflection of matter contributing ideas back to being. C, the world and the world's laws are knowable as they can be examined by practice, challenging Kant's idea of, quote, things in themselves, end quote. Because of this, Stalin argues that there are laws of social development and that socialism is a science. Part 3, historical materialism. In this section, Stalin asks, what is the, quote, chief determinant force, end quote, in society? It is the mode of production of material goods, not the geographical environment or the growth of the population. As Stalin states, quote, this force historical materialism holds is the method of procuring the means of life necessary for human existence, the mode of production of material values, food, clothing, footwear, houses, fuel, instruments of production, etc., which are indispensable for the life and development of society, end quote. Stalin also names two aspects of production, which are the instruments of production and the, quote, relation of men to each other in the process of production, men's relations of production, end quote. B, the first feature of production, quote, it never stays at one point for a long time and is always in a stage of change and development, and that furthermore, changes in the mode of production inevitably call forth changes in the whole social system, social ideas, political views, and political institutions. They call forth a reconstruction of the whole social and political order, end quote. Thus, the party of the proletariat must study the laws of the development of production, so that it can, quote, proceed primarily from the laws of development of production from the laws of economic development of society, end quote. C, in the second feature of production, Stalin states that, quote, its changes and developments always begin with changes and development of the productive forces, and in the first place with changes and development of the instruments of production, end quote, and lays out the stages of history, which are primitive communism, slavery, feudalism, capitalism, and socialism. Additionally, the capitalist relations of production no longer correspond to the state of productive forces of society, creating irreconcilable contradictions. D, the third feature of production, quote, the rise of new productive forces and the relations of production corresponding to them does not take place separately from the old system, after the disappearance of the old system, but within the old system. It takes place not as a result of the deliberate and conscious activity of man, but spontaneously, unconsciously, independently of the will of man, end quote. However, this spontaneous process of development does not mean that the change from old relations to new relations will occur smoothly. Rather, Stalin contends it will result in revolution. So that's the Wikipedia summary of Stalin's dialectical and historical materialism. Let's see what White says. The passage on Bogdanov is an important one in the short course because it is a preliminary to the section in Chapter 4 entitled Dialectical and Historical Materialism, written by Stalin. Here, over 30 pages, Stalin sets out the theoretical side of Marxism as Stalin believes it ought to be understood. His approach is practical since he repeats several times that a correct understanding of the subject is essential if one is not to make mistakes in policy. Stalin's approach is also didactic in that Stalin systematically defines the terms Stalin uses and provides examples mainly from the Soviet experience. Stalin begins by stating that dialectical materialism is the world outlook of the Marxist-Leninist Party. Dialectical materialism is called dialectical materialism because dialectical materialism's approach to the phenomena of nature, dialectical materialism's method of studying and apprehending the phenomena of nature, is dialectical. While dialectical materialism's interpretation of the phenomenon of nature, dialectical materialism's conception of these phenomena, dialectical materialism's theory, is materialistic. Stalin then goes on to define, quote, dialectics, end quote, and, quote, materialism, end quote, separately. According to Stalin, dialectics regards the phenomena of nature, not in isolation as metaphysics does, but in relation to other phenomena. Also, in contrast to metaphysics, dialectics holds that nature is not in a state of rest and immobility, but in a state of continuous movement and change. Here Stalin cites in support of this latter contention the opinion of Engels, quote, in the dialectics of nature, end quote. A further contrast between metaphysics and dialectics is that whereas the former saw change as a continuous process, dialectics, or a further contrast between metaphysics and dialectics, is that whereas metaphysics saw change as a continuous process, dialectics envisages rapid transformations from quantity to quality. Lastly, contrary to metaphysics, dialectics holds that contradictions are inherent in all things, an idea which Stalin supported by a quotation from Lenin's philosophical notebooks. Stalin's three characteristics of dialectics had no interconnection. They were offered to the reader of the short course as individual aphorisms, nor did they have any particular philosophical connotation, being more in the character of homespun wisdom than socialist theory. The practical implication of the laws of dialectics, moreover, were somewhat predictable. According to Stalin, a lesson that could be drawn from the dialectical point of view on change, quote, if one were not to err in policy, end quote, is that, quote, one must be a revolutionary, not a reformist, end quote. The implication of contradictions being in the nature of things was that one should not conceal the contradictions of the capitalist system, but disclose and unravel the contradictions of the capitalist system. Having given Stalin's definition of dialectics, Stalin then proceeds to explain what materialism was. Defining, quote, materialism and, quote, matter was something that had caused Plekhanov great difficulty, but caused Stalin no problems. Stalin's method was to contrast materialism with idealism, and to define idealism in such a way that it appeared absurd to hold such a view as idealism. Thus, according to Stalin, contrary to idealism, which denies the possibility of knowing the world and the world's laws, which does not recognize objective truth, which holds that the world is full of, quote, things in themselves, end quote, that can never be known, Marxist philosophical materialism holds that the world and its laws are fully knowable. In support, here Stalin quoted the passage from Engels' Ludwig Feuerbach, which argued that the most telling refutation of idealism was practice, experiment, and industry, the fact that people were able to replicate natural processes and to make accurate predictions from scientific data. Stalin, however, did not cite in this connection, as Engels had done, Marx's theses on Feuerbach. In terms of, quote, historical materialism, end quote, Stalin held that the factor that determined the life of society was its mode of production. It followed that, quote, if it were not to err in policy, end quote, the party of the proletariat must, both in the drafting of its program and in its practical activities, proceed primarily from the laws of development of production, from the laws of the economic development of society. There then followed a disquisition on the relationship of the productive forces of society to its relations of production, and how these correspond exactly in the Soviet Union. The section on, quote, historical materialism, end quote, concluded by reproducing the famous passage from Marx's preface to the Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, in which Marx outlined his conception of the base and superstructure of society and of how people's consciousness was determined by their social being. In the fraught atmosphere of 1938, people's critical faculties were suspended. The Soviet philosopher M.B. Mitten said of the short course that, quote, the treasury of Marxism-Leninism has been enriched by a work which no doubt stands on the first rank beside such classical theoretical works as the Communist Manifesto, Das Kapital, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, end quote. M.B. Mitten. It says Mark Mitten, or M.B. Mitten, was born in 1901 and died in 1987, and was a Soviet Marxist-Leninist philosopher, university lecturer, and professor of philosophy faculty of Moscow State University, 1964 to 1968, and 1978 to 1985. Mark Borisovich Mitten was interested primarily in dialectical and historical materialism, the philosophy of history, and criticism of bourgeois philosophy. Back to the text. Quite clearly, it was nothing of the kind. So let me repeat what the last sentence I was reading. The Soviet philosopher M.B. Mitten said of the short course that, quote, the treasury of Marxism-Leninism has been enriched by a work which no doubt stands on the first rank beside such classical theoretical works as the Communist Manifesto, Das Kapital, and Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. End quote. Quite clearly, it was nothing of the kind. The short course was a plodding scholastic work of semi-fiction, but judgment upon the short course was stamped with the fear and menace of the times. The short course may not have been on a par with the works that Mitten mentioned, but for a time, the short course's influence was greater than that of any of them. The short course was a central reading for generations of Soviet citizens and was the obligatory template for all works of history and philosophy produced during Stalin's lifetime, and indeed beyond. Very little remains in the short course of the conceptions that are incorporated in Marx's Das Kapital. In their journey through the Russian revolutionary movement and the creation of the Soviet state, Marx's ideas were emptied of their original content in such a way that only the outer shell remained. If one's knowledge of Marx's writings came only from the short course, it would be impossible to reconstruct what Marx's original intention could have been. In particular, it would be impossible in the evidence of the short course to deduce why it was that Marx should have taken up the study of Russia. After Stalin's death in 1953, measures were taken by Khrushchev and later by Gorbachev to undo the damage that had been done to Soviet scholarship by the practices of the Stalin era. One should not underestimate the achievements of the post-Stalin period in this regard. In fact, some of the sources used in the present work were published at this time. However, the problem with Soviet leaders was that they dared not tamper too far with the precepts of Marxism-Leninism for fear of undermining the legitimacy of the Soviet regime. Moreover, there was the difficulty that historical perceptions have their own momentum. Once a version of history has gained currency, however erroneous it may be, it is difficult to correct. The omission from it of particular events or personalities, or the inclusion in it of spurious phenomenon, is not appreciated. Allied to this is the problem of collective memory. The generation of Soviet theorists who first molded party history to suit political conjunctures has long since left the scene. How can later generations correct these distortions of fact, when they do not recognize that they are in fact distortions? For these reasons, Stalin's short course continued to exercise an influence right up to the demise of the Soviet regime. To the present time, one can still encounter conceptions of Russian and Soviet history that are derived from that source. The end.